This is the Outwith podcast, and I'm Hala Mohideen, and I'm delighted to announce that this next series of episodes of the podcast are being produced in cooperation with the Ferret. Now, for those who don't already know the Ferret, it's an award-winning, independent, investigative media platform, media cooperative rather, because it's owned entirely by its readers and subscribers, of which I am proud to say I am one. Now, it delivers cutting-edge investigations, and their scoops includes investigations into UK arms sales to Yemen, animal rights abuses in Scottish farming, and nuclear safety breaches by the Ministry of Defence. And they often get their scoops well before the major news outlets. So they're well worth the reads. They like to nose up the trousers of power, keep everyone to account, and their ethos is firmly aligned with our own. And to celebrate, we're offering a special offer for our listeners as well. If you want to subscribe to the Ferret, if you use the code Outwith19 when you sign up for a monthly subscription, you'll get the first 3 months free. If you sign up for an annual subscription using the code Outwith19, you will get £9 off your subscription. It works out to around a third off. So it's a very, very good deal. So to take advantage of this offer and to keep ahead of the game, to find out more about the investigations both at home and abroad, head to theferret.scot, hit subscribe, and use the code Outwith19 to take advantage of that discount. Well, hello and welcome back to Outwith, the podcast that takes you beyond the headlines and beyond our borders. I'm Hala Mohideen. Now, the Democratic freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been making the headlines since well before she was elected to Congress. But in early February 2019, AOC, as she's known, went even more viral than before when she quizzed ethics experts about money in politics and government corruption. That video has been watched over 39 million times, possibly over 40 million as we record this podcast. But what it's also done is it's brought the phrase dark money back into the spotlight. But what exactly is dark money? And is it really a threat to our democracy? And if it is, how serious a problem is it? Well, to find out, I'd like to welcome Peter Geoghegan to the kitchen. Peter is the investigations editor for the news website OpenDemocracy.net. And they've been investigating dark money in politics, specifically British politics, for about 2 years now. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me in the kitchen.
Yeah. Let's just start off. What exactly is dark money? It's a phrase that you hear bandied about left, right and centre, especially if you spend a lot of time on Twitter. But what is it?
Well, really what dark money means is it's money that gets involved in the political system. We don't know where it comes from. It's a phrase that really originates in America, particularly known with a book called Dark Money by Jane Mayer, who's a really famous New Yorker journalist who started looking at this influence of money in politics. And it's really something that we traditionally would think about in America, because America had this big decision called Citizens United, which means that corporations can have the same right to citizens, so they can give political donations and they can do it basically in secret. That's where you hear these super PACs. If you're wondering, if you're watching a presidential election in America, you're going, what's a super PAC? Well, a super PAC is basically a group of really dark money, and you don't know where it's coming from. And the idea is that it's influencing the political process. So it's people buying influence in ways that we don't understand. And that's where the dark aspect comes from. We've always known that money is involved in politics. People make political donations. I'm from Ireland. I grew up well aware of what political corruption looked like. But the difference with dark money is that we actually, at root, you just don't know where the source of this money is. So these are political actors that are really much in the public sphere. Whether we see it a lot in Britain, say with think tanks, we don't know where they get their funding from often, or it's political campaigning that we don't know where the money that's behind that. And we're actually speaking just in the week that these, I think, how many is it now? Eight Labour and 3 Conservatives have set up this new independent grouping. They're not registered political party. They're actually registered as a company. So we don't know where their funding comes from either. So it's anything like that. It's any issue where we just don't know where the money that's driving our politics is coming from.
But it's not necessarily illegal, is it?
No, not necessarily illegal. Actually, often not illegal at all. That's part of the problem, really. So if you look at, in the UK at the moment, we're recording this in the run to Brexit, and you might be listening to it in a year's time, and we might be still recording this in the run to Brexit. But if you look at who's been, I just published a story this week that was looking at who's been influencing the British government around No Deal Brexit and kind of what you'd say a hard Brexit. And one of the big kind of people putting ideas into that space are a group called the Institute of Economic Affairs. They're a think tank. They've been going since the 1950s. They're libertarian, like kind of very radical free marketeers, but they don't declare where their donations come from. So we don't know. We know from some leaks over the last years that they've got money from the tobacco lobby. We know they've got money from the sugar lobby, from the gambling lobby, and they often take what we see as controversial positions. So they're often against tobacco regulation, against sugar taxes, in favour of privatising the NHS, in favour of privatising bits of the BBC. But really, we don't know where that money comes from. So what you're talking about there is influence in the political process, and we don't know who's buying that influence. And if we don't know where the money is coming from, then it's really hard. It's quite insidious then, because you don't know
who's influencing what.
If you're watching a television program and someone comes on from a representative body, it's the Import and Exporters Association. Well, you know what their position is. You know their members are importers and exporters, and they've got a position. Or the Scottish Whisky Association, or any other kind of variation on that. But the issue is when you've got political funding coming into the political process, and we don't know where it comes from. And probably the most well-known and kind of egregious example of that was Aaron Banks during the Brexit referendum, because you had like £8 million of spending on a massive referendum. We just know where that money came from.
Now, so we're meandering onto Brexit, and I guess part of the reason we're talking about dark money and this influence in politics is because we're at, let's just say, understatement of the century, a rather pivotal moment in British and European politics. So the stakes are high. Was this dark money business? I mean, we know that money is politics in the US. So money is politics and money is speech, rather, in US politics. So it's been around there for a while and it's accepted there. Is this a relatively new concept that we're seeing here in Europe and in Britain particularly since all this Brexit business has been happening?
I don't know. It's actually quite difficult, because really what you're talking about is we've got what's called the Electoral Commission. So in the United Kingdom, we have an Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission regulates elections in the United Kingdom, and part of what it does is regulates campaign donations, which are made during the kind of.
And why do they do that? Why do they regulate the amount of money that goes in?
Well, because that's a decision that was taken. We took a decision about the early 2000s to say, look, you can only spend X amount of money during a political campaign. You can only spend so much per constituency. We just had a case quite recently in South Thanet from 2015 general election where an MP who's still sitting, a Conservative MP, was accused of breaking electoral spending to do with how this battle bus is traveling around the country. And this can often feel and seem quite strange and arcane. And one of the reasons why this matters is because actually the amount of money that candidates are allowed to spend in each constituency is actually quite low. It's only £15,000.
Which is nothing if you look at this in US terms.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the reasons why, in some ways, small amounts of money can make a much bigger difference in the United Kingdom than they can in the US. In the US, they are now well into the realms of millions and millions and millions just in small races in places that no one, very few of our listeners are even heard of, way before you get to presidential elections or kind of Senate and House races. Whereas in the United Kingdom, we're not in that space because it's quite tightly regulated. So we're regulated by a regulator came in the early 2000s. But there's a lot of issues around kind of how that process works. But even before the regulator, you would have had lots of money floating around politics, lots of donations, and they weren't made public. And partly what's happened is since the regulators come in and donations are made more public, a lot of people who would have given money in the past, particularly, really what you're talking about in Britain is most donations went to Conservatives and Labour got their money from the unions. That was pretty much the breakdown until Tony Blair came into office. It was just the nature of how political funding worked in the UK. Not that surprisingly. Organised Labour backed the Party of Labour, Capital backed the Party of Capital, so Conservatives and Labour. What you're seeing now is a bit more of a shift because people don't like to, people don't like to be seen to be donating to political parties often because it can beg the question, why are you doing that? And so that's one of the reasons, what you're seeing in the United Kingdom is probably mirroring what's happening in the States, is that people are looking for other ways to get to influence the political process rather than making outright donations to political parties.
Okay. So that's kind of where we are now. We have this regulation that, designed, one would say, to protect democracy, to protect so that we know where different views are coming for, so you can try and determine the motivation behind a donation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, that's pretty much that's really what the idea is coming from. But if you look at, we're speaking just in the week that a new report came out from the DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, and what they found is basically the Electoral Commission is a failing institution, because if in Britain the maximum penalty for breaking electoral law is £20,000. So if you look, we won't go into the Brexit referendum yet, but if you look at the Brexit referendum, the ceiling was £7 million for the official campaigns. So if breaking the law, you get fined £20,000 on the ceiling of £7 million. It's not a huge, it's not a great deterrent.
You're talking those sums.
You're not really going, oh, wow, God, I mustn't do this, and this is going to be really bad. And that's really kind of if you look at the work that I've been doing on OpenDemocracy.net, which is been looking at a lot of this kind of this kind of world, what you're finding time and time again is that the regulatory system that we have is not fit for purpose. And that's what the DCS committee has found as well, that these are laws designed back in in an analog age, and they're now been having to come to bear in a digital world, where you're seeing not just a digital campaigning, but also new ways of spending money that are really kind of novel in the British political context.
Right, let's look at some of the reporting that you've done then, because you guys were almost, one could say, at the forefront of investigating dark money, and this all came. Tell us how it started. Why did you start getting involved in this investigation into dark money?
Well, it's quite funny. It's this is not what I would expect to have been talking about when I first started looking at this like 2 years ago. Basically, I got a phone call from Adam Ramsey. I was working as a teaching journalism at the University of West Scotland in Ayr, and my friend and Adam Ramsey, who lives in Edinburgh, who works for Open Democracy, my colleague, he rang me up and said, "Look, I'm really interested in the Democratic Unionist Party's Brexit campaign." And how they spent loads of money. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I'm interested in that too. And what had happened was, this was probably February 2017, so about 7-8 months after the Brexit vote. And during, when Adam was going around the UK covering the Brexit referendum, he noticed in Edinburgh people with placards, vote leave, and it said down the bottom, a little imprint, which everyone has to have in their placards, supported by Jeffrey Donaldson on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party. So it was an imprint, an official imprint. And he was like, well, why is the Democratic Unionist Party having placards in Edinburgh?
Well, just for context, the Democratic Unionist Party is a party which is only to be found in Northern Ireland.
Yes, they're a Northern Ireland only party. They don't run candidates in Great Britain. So that's kind of interesting. And I noticed, I've been covering the referendum as well. I was in Sunderland the day before the referendum, and I was on the train, and I noticed the free newspaper, the Metro. And the Metro had a huge, big 4-page wraparound ad, vote leave, take back control, the big vote leave message. And on the back was the DUP's kind of lion logo, and again, sponsored by the Democratic Unionist Party. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Like, what are they doing? Like, that's going to be expensive. And the Metro doesn't even circulate in Northern Ireland. So I was like, well, that's kind of strange. So I'd kind of thinking about it. And I'd also was aware that there's, in Northern Ireland, because I used to cover Northern Ireland politics and I lived in Belfast, that there was a loophole from the Troubles where electoral donations were not declared, because it was thought it might be dangerous for people who are giving money to political parties. They could be targeted. So there's no declaration of political donations. So I was aware that it is possible to spend money in Northern Ireland with a political party during a referendum, because it's all one constituency. There's not 650 constituencies, it's just one. So I was kind of interested in this. So myself and Adam started doing some more research and doing some digging, and we started trying to put together, like, well, what kind of spending would this have been? And so basically we just wrote a story about how the DUP had spent a huge amount of money on this referendum campaign, far more than it ever spent on any general election. I think there'd been a general election the year before and they'd spent £50,000, and it turned out they'd spent about £35,000 during the Brexit vote, which is huge, especially by Northern Irish standards. So that was the kind of that was the first story we did on this, and it kind of snowballed from there. And we started, it started just asking these questions about, well, where is this money coming from? And that led us to asking loads more questions about lots of different individuals.
And one of those individuals was Aaron Banks. So for people who perhaps haven't been following this as closely as we have, A, you're very lucky, and B, Aaron Banks. So he was one of these, he's colourful character, very pally with Nigel Farage, who, of course, is very well known as the former frontman of UKIP, and certainly at the time of the Brexit vote he was. But how does Aaron Banks come into all of this?
Well, so what happened was we started writing stories about DUP's donation. And we started snowballing there. We wrote a load of stories, and then eventually the DP had to say where some of their money had come from, or did they name one person? We still don't know. So, if you're out there, we're still at Open Democracy trying to find out where the DP money came from and other funding. So, if you go to www.opendemocracy.net, we're still sort of crowdfunding to try and find out this. But we then started asking loads of other questions about where did the other money in the referendum come from? And as a journalist, I found it really interesting because I realised not many people had asked these questions. Yeah. Which has really surprised me. So I started looking at Aaron Banks because Aaron Banks had spent a huge amount of money during the Brexit referendum. This guy really came out of nowhere, came out of left field. And he just, he basically became, he'd been in the 80s, a kind of a failed Conservative candidate in the council elections down in England. And then in 2015, he emerged on national television saying, I'm going to give £100,000 to UKIP. And Michael Gove said, I've never heard of Aaron Banks. He said, I'm going to give £1 million to UKIP. So that's where Aaron Banks came, 2015, out of nowhere.
Yeah, he did come out of nowhere, didn't he?
Really came out of nowhere. He was a businessman in Bristol. And I became interested because I worked out he'd spent at least £8 million on the Brexit vote. So it's a huge amount of money. He hadn't been the official campaign. He tried and failed to be the official campaign, but he was very close to Nigel Farage. He ran Leave.eu, which some people might remember is particularly... During the Brexit vote, you had Vote Leave, which is the official campaign, and kind of did more of the global Britain. We're all kind of leaving the European Union to go out into the world, whereas Leave.eu did a lot more of the breaking point, the quite much more like kind of nativist rhetoric. So Leave.eu was quite a very important part of the Leave referendum. So I started looking into him and asking questions.
Just to cut you off. So one was the official campaign.
Yeah.
And that meant in terms of spending rules, they were able to qualify for a higher threshold.
They could spend up to £7 million.
Okay.
So the official campaign can spend £7 million, and unofficial campaign can only spend £700,000.
Okay.
And so we started looking.
So already the sums of 8 million is
you're kind of going, whoa, how did you manage to spend £8 million, given that you weren't the official campaign?
I mean, I could spend £8 million.
Yeah.
Quite easily.
Yeah. Yes.
But,
yes. We
mostly on shoes.
Yeah. I was going to make that gag, and I thought better of it.
I know. God, see, well, I'm much more of a hack than you are. No, but it's spending that amount of money, is.
It's a difficult. It's probably it is quite a hard. It's
difficult to get it under the table, if you like out of sight, because it's especially when we're operating in an environment where there is this supposed scrutiny and there are these legal limits. And if you're the official, because there was quite a fight to be the official.
Yeah,
campaign.
there was Aaron Banks really took this very seriously and fought very hard.
Yeah.
But there's a few things. There's a few ways you can do that. Really, one is you can do like Leave.eu said they did, which was spend loads of money before what's called the official campaigning period. Right. So in the United Kingdom, I can give money to political parties and not have to declare it if it's outside of a regulated campaign period. So what they did was one way of doing it, spending a lot of money before the campaign, or that's how they said they did it. Mm-hmm. So we can argue the toss about whether they did or not. And actually, the Electoral Commission found that they didn't do some of the things they said they did. But you could say, look, instead of the official campaign, it was the last the last 12 weeks from mid-April up until the 23rd of June referendum date. So you could spend money. You could only spend up to £700,000 in that tight bit. But in the months before that, and as my whistleblowers, I've done a lot of big stories on Leave.eu. Whistleblowers within Leave.eu subsequently showed that this spending was going on in extensive amounts of money. Millions of pounds have been spent even before the year of the referendum had started. So that's one way. And the other way you can do, which is what Leave.eu and Vote Leave did, was set up new groups, which basically are you. So you've got Leave.eu, but you've got Grassroots Out, you've got Go, you've got Labour Leave, you've got Vote Leave, you've got Be Leave, which is, this is a plethora, it's a complex world. But really, at the back of all these different names is something quite simple, which is basically people trying to spend money. Mm-hmm. At a time when money is coming in the door, you need to try and get it out of the door. And
money's influence.
Money is influence, of course. Money is influence. Vote Leave spent over £3 million on Facebook ads in the last couple of days of the referendum. And it's these are serious amounts of money, especially in the context of British politics. So, and this is what people were trying to do. And that's one of the ways Aaron Banks was able to do it. But what I ended up doing was actually looking, not so much, I subsequently looked at a lot of what happened at Leave.eu, but that was quite later. But what I started off asking was a simple question. Is Aaron Banks rich enough to be able to spend that amount of money? Which is quite, it's a classic journalism question. You follow the money and you ask, can someone afford to do something? So if you take that he spent about £8 to £10 million in the Brexit vote. He's often, and I started looking into his business affairs, looking through company filings. And what's interesting as well, it's not that difficult to create a persona of yourself in the media. So he'd been listed as saying being worth between 100 and 250 million pounds. I think it was probably in the Sunday Times rich list originally.
Sounds quite Trumpian.
It's quite Trumpy. And then what happens is, the way, and journalists, I'm not, I do it myself sometimes. You look through press cuttings and you say, oh, he's worth between that, and you just use that figure. It just becomes the figure that goes around and around and around and around. He becomes a multimillionaire. It's worth hundreds of millions. And then when you sit back and go, actually, how much money is there in this? And when we started to do that, you're like, oh, there's not all that much money in these companies. And this is a lot of money to spend. And so we started looking at that. The Electoral Commission had already looked at Arron Banks and said, there's nothing to see here, it's all fine. After reporting done by us and others, they reopened the investigation and subsequently fined Arron Banks for 3 breaches of electoral law. Arron Banks is currently under investigation by the National Crime Agency, who believed that money that he spent during the Brexit referendum was illegitimate. Had not come from a legitimate source, because political funding in the United Kingdom has to come from either a business or a person who's domiciled and registered in Britain. And also the Information Commissioner's Office fined Arron Banks for breaking data protection law during the Brexit referendum. So subsequently, after, I'm not just saying we were the only ones doing it, but after reporting started to happen about Arron Banks, people started, the authorities finally started looking at him. And some of the reporting was just, we did a story about his diamond mines in Lesotho, which was subsequently followed up by Channel 4 News and BBC. Yeah, well, he actually did the story originally in March, and nobody credited us subsequently. And to give you a little,
so cheeky. I hate it.
It's very cheeky. And to give you a little bit of what's interesting as well is how the media worked with this story. So we, for a long time, were kind of pushing this story. Carol Cardwaller in The Guardian as well. Some people in the FT like Cynthia Murku. But in general, the media was really resistant to this story. And it was only when stuff came out about Arron Banks, our emails connecting Arron Banks with Russia, that they finally started really looking at him. But back in March 2018, we started looking at Arron Banks as the Lesotho diamond mines. Well, we'd been doing it for a few months before that, because Arron Banks came up and said, I'm going to fund a new political party with Nigel Farage. I'm going to fund it by my diamonds from Lesotho. I was like, I've been to Lesotho before. It's a really small, very poor, very beautiful mountainous country, surrounded completely by South Africa. South Africa didn't overrun it because they didn't want it, because it's so poor. I was kind of going, what diamonds? I'm not a geologist, but like diamonds basically only come at the end of rivers, because that's the process that goes.
Not at the source.
Yes, not at the source. Exactly. Yes, you don't need to be a geologist.
Not much of a geologist either. But.
Yeah. And so I started digging into this story, and myself and colleagues at another small investigative outlet, Source Material, and also working with a journalist on the ground in Lesotho, we're able to stand up a load of stuff. We were able to find out, we're the world's expert in Lesotho diamonds, telling us that the find was geologically impossible. And also I was able to discover that Arron Banks' political consultancy was supposed to be consulting in Lesotho with a political party, which normally a consultancy does work for a party and the party pays the consultant. In this case, the consultancy was paying the political parties, which asks a big question: why was Arron Banks paying Lesotho politicians? And I couldn't give that story away on Fleet Street. I couldn't give it to people for free.
Well, this is crazy though. But so given, you guys initially seem to be the only ones asking these questions. Why was there this reluctance for people to, for the Electoral Commission to investigate this, and why were other media outlets reluctant to pick? Is it because it's difficult following money, it's difficult going through dry documents, and it is hard slog, and oftentimes, you don't get much easy reward at the end of it. So was it a laziness issue, or were there dark forces behind it?
No, I don't. I think it was neither dark forces nor laziness. It's kind of, I think it's a narrowness of kind of thought processes almost. I had this conversation with a lot of friends, all my best friends. Some of my best friends are journalists. And a lot of my friends are journalists. It's the world I work in. And for a long time, they were kind of going, why are you interested in this? Because the idea was the referendum had happened. This was a thing that was over. It's an event. But for me, it's not about the referendum at all. It's about the process of democracy. It's about how we regulate our democracy, how our democracy works. And this is such a key flagship moment. And the thing that was interesting about the referendum was it was so unusual. Whereas we don't have referendums in this country very often. How they're regulated is very haphazard, even compared to general elections. And unlike general elections, where political parties do exist after general election, if a political party breaks electoral law, it looks bad. It looked bad for the Conservatives to have to go to court in South Tannet there recently. It went on for a long time. One of their party workers was found guilty. The judge said said damning indictment about Conservative Party processes around this. That's not the same with a referendum. These campaigns disappeared. You don't talk. There's nobody. Who do you call? On the 24th of June, Vote Leave doesn't exist anymore. Leave.eu doesn't exist. Whatever. I can't even remember what the Remain campaign was called. Stronger in, but no, most people can't exactly. But they don't exist.
Not the most memorable of campaigns.
Yeah. So it was a much more, and also it was such a seismic political moment. So that was one of the reasons I started looking at it. I think the resistance towards looking at it from journalists was a kind of sense, maybe partly, did we miss this story while it was happening? And also a sense of, well, that was the past. Why are you looking at something? Why are you bothered? I had this from people who said to me, why are you bothered about something that happened in the past? The referendum's over. And I think people felt uneasy because they felt like they were somehow getting involved with like being on one side of the referendum rather than the other. And I think when I started doing this work, people go, it's because you're a Remainer or something? No, it's not about that. It's about, this is the integrity of the democratic process. And if it's, because what happened during the Brexit referendum can and will happen again because they're the same electoral laws which don't work.
Now, it's interesting that you bring this up, the idea that, what are your motivations for chasing this? Is this to discredit the pro-Leave campaigns? Was there one of the, when I sort of go down the rabbit hole and follow the tweets and stuff, and whenever you prevent this incontrovertible evidence that there has been wrongdoing by one of the Leave campaigns, the immediate thing they hit you back with is, yeah, but the Remain campaign did this too.
Yeah,
did they?
Well, that's, I think, it's an interesting question. I've looked at a little bit of it. I must confess.
Is there any dark money behind the Remain campaigns, and are people looking into it?
There was some, what you had more happening with the Remain campaigns was more. Basically, Remain had a lot more business support, so they got a lot more money from businesses. And what they did was they did some of the same stuff in terms of setting up shadowy companies that are kind of setting up like ginger groups that looked a bit similar, which is what we saw. It's kind of, a lot of it came from the Scottish referendum originally. And one of the reasons, the same process happened in the Scottish referendum. The reason why, to be blunt, you end up looking at, I think partly with the Leave campaign, there's two things. One is a lot more. There was no Aaron Banks figure on the Remain side. Just the money was coming from, and you can argue a toss about it, but coming from establishment money. Basically, the Remain campaign was an establishment campaign in which you had big business and big money kind of lining up going, this is something we don't want. Here's some money to stop it happening. And you did see some similar things happening in the Scottish referendum too. And one of the reasons I think a lot of us, in retrospect, I would like to have done more work in looking at what happened in the Scottish referendum, but just journalistically, when something doesn't produce change, you're less likely to start focusing on it. The reason I think the Leave campaign is partly to do with the extent of what was going on. What you didn't have, say, on the Remain side was things like, so Darren Grimes, who's been reported to Met Police. So Darren Grimes was a 23-year-old fashion student who set up this little campaign called Believe. And they think they brought in about £107 in about 3 or 4 months in the run-up to the Brexit referendum.
£107?
£107.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's not a lot of money.
Not a lot of money. And then in the last week of the campaign, they spent £675,000.
Okay.
And I started looking at this story then after I'd done some of the DP stories. And I sent FOIs to the Electoral Commission, Freedom of Information requests to the Electoral Commission to ask for their correspondence in relation to Darren Grimes. And what I got back was really interesting because the Electoral Commission internally were saying, this is really suspect, but we're not going to investigate it. And what transpired to have happened, because then on the back of the stories we ran, the Electoral Commission did reopen their investigation, subsequently found Darren Grimes guilty of breaking the law, fined him £20,000 and reported him to the Met Police. But what had happened was that basically Vote Leave had given Darren Grimes £25,000, and another pro-Vote Leave campaigner had given him £50,000. And this had all been spent on Facebook ads with an obscure data analysis company in Canada called Aggregate IQ.
Are they linked to Cambridge Analytica?
Who were linked to Cambridge Analytica. But even more interestingly, this money, and under electoral law, you can't do this. You can't coordinate campaigns. If you do that, you can't declare the spending separately. If me and you would have a campaign and sit down tonight and go, you do this and I'll do that, and I'll spend £10,000 and you spend £10,000, we couldn't declare that separately. We'd have to put it together and say it was £20,000. We get closer to the ceiling of what you can spend. Darren Grimes, that money was never even resting in Darren Grimes' bank account, to use a Father Ted expression. It was paid directly on his behalf from Vote Leave to Aggregate IQ. And initially, the Electoral Commission ruled that wasn't coordination. That it was okay for Vote Leave to spend money with somebody else,
Use someone
and just use
else's
someone
name.
else's name, and that they weren't coordinating it.
Right,
As
okay.
if they would spend 675,000 and go, I've got my fingers in my ears. I don't know what you
What are
want
the
to do with
Electoral
this.
Commission playing at then? I mean, is this something that...
I think...
because that just looks bonkers.
What you have in the UK, and this has happened to me time and again, it's not just the Electoral Commission, almost all the work I do, I've ended up having, whether it's Charity Commission, Companies House, HMRC, is we have regulation in the United Kingdom. We have these things that look like regulators and they smell like regulators, and from the outside they're regulators. But to be honest, they're paper tigers. If you want to commit malfeasance, to do things that are above and beyond the law, the chances of you getting caught are really, really small. You're just not going to, it's not the place you're going to be in.
It's
so low.
Not have enough staff, or are they just can't be bothered, or are they useless?
Well,
I don't know.
It's the fines are the fines are very low. They've shed staff. They've had staff leave them. There's a sense of they feel very embattled. There's a sense, the Electoral Commission was singled out by a number of pro-Brexit MPs and said it was a Remainer front. So there's a sense, and this is the same across these different bodies. Like the Institute of Economic Affairs, the think tank, that's a charity. That's still regulated by the Charity Commission, even though they've now subsequently been wrapping them over the knuckles because of their pro-Brexit coverage. But a lot of these think tanks are registered charities. And so there's a lot of these areas which are really, really, if you're involved, as my work has taken me to, I've been, involved in covering fraud and my work on the Brexit referendum. You talk to liquidators as I do. These companies have gone bust, owing revenue, hundreds of thousands of pounds, with money in all sorts of dodgy places. And the liquidator is only given £1,000 from HMRC to close a case. They're not able to go and fight these cases. So and if you are someone who's in that position, the chances of you being brought to book and actually having to face anything that looks like a criminal proceedings is really, really low. And I think that's the big issue. And what happened with the Brexit referendum, and the reason it's so interesting in some respects, is that on the Remain campaign, it was an analog campaign. They were still analog. They were still doing stuff like ringing people's houses. They were still putting up posters everywhere. They were still getting money and spending money in very analog ways. What Leave was, and you saw that, Dominic Cummings, who was the head of Vote Leave, is a very smart man. And he's an interesting guy in many respects. And they were pushing the envelope in a way we've never seen before in British politics. They were spending money and doing things in ways we've never seen before. And the way the Remain campaign spent money was actually very predictable and very, very old school. And that's one of the reasons it's just not as interesting, because there wasn't the same kind of chicanery going on.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of the chicanery, versus commas, that the Leave campaign was carrying out, because they were very much more. They were online. They were going after people rather than the sort of terrible leaflet through the door. Because everyone throws out leaflets through the door, unless it's a pizza delivery menu. They were really going direct into your Facebook feeds, into your Twitter, into your. Were they doing Instagram at that point? I mean, but very much the social media that people are using every day.
Yeah, there was a huge spend on social media, and we only found this out. We only found out what the Vote Leave ads looked like a few months ago, because they were released to the DCMS committee, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport committee, looking at fake news. Leave.eu wouldn't release their adverts, but Vote Leave did. And they're really quite stark, the adverts. They're the adverts that they spent millions on the last few days. And they're all about pictures of maps of the world with Turkey and saying 7 million Turks are going to come. I was in Albania recently doing some training and showing them some of these Vote Leave adverts, and they were saying, and they've got pictures of Albania, and the Albanians were going, why didn't they? What's wrong with us? What the hell is going on? And they were very targeted at these and actually what's interesting as well is they were targeted messages that weren't being pushed in public. And it was funny for me. And was
it the kind of thing that would be illegal then to say in public?
Not illegal, but it would look bad. It would look bad against the message, you see. And what social media allowed them to do, and I subsequently covered the Donald Trump election campaign. I drove across the States, and I saw something happening there. It allows you to say lots of different messages and target them at specific people. And that's the big difference. So if back in the old days, you put up a poster at the end of your road. Actually, you don't know, because you're not allowed to put up posters. But you put up a poster, and everyone would see what you said on the poster.
Yeah.
And I remember living in Belfast, and it was a general election, and the Ulster Unionists ran on this. They had a slogan: "Ordinary, decent people vote Ulster Unionists." It was an awful slogan, and people were really people took the mickey out of it and lost them votes because it was everywhere. Whereas online, it's just you. And you can target really well. You can actually create, it's in real time, you can alpha beta test hundreds and thousands of adverts. That's what happened during the Trump campaign in real time to see how people respond. The Brexit referendum doesn't seem to have been quite as sophisticated as that, but that's where we're going. And it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this work is that this is the direction of travel of our politics. And right now, for example, in the United Kingdom, there's probably about, in the last month, well over £500,000 been spent on Facebook ads from various campaigns. Initially, they were more from the anti-Brexit campaigns, but now it's far more pro-Brexit. The anti-Brexit campaign's funding is quite opaque. A lot of it's the People's Vote and Best for Britain. We know where the headline money comes from. A lot of it comes from the Open Society, from George Soros and other people like that, who's become this bogeyman on the right. And a lot of the money from the pro-Brexit ads, we just have no idea where it comes from.
So this is the direction of travel.
This is the direction of travel, yeah.
But how do we regulate that? But, are you able to regulate that? Because, Facebook is global.
Well, yes, that's true. But at the moment, what we do is hope that tech companies will regulate it for us. That seems to be
they don't.
Indeed, and that's the problem. That's the conversation we need to have. And it's interesting. It's happening in Ireland, actually. The Irish Parliament's got a working group that's looking at this. They're looking to set up a new electoral regulator. They've realised that the old one has failed, which it has. It doesn't work properly. And they're looking at it. What's really stark, and one of the reasons I still do this work and we still do it at OpenDemocracy, is that this isn't happening. This change isn't happening in the United Kingdom. We're not learning from the stuff that happened before. We're not looking to change.
But then is that because perhaps people don't accept there's a problem? Because I'm very aware whenever you raise anything to do with Brexit, you're going to infuriate people. And, it's become super, super tribal. So if, you voted Brexit, you see any attack on their referendum win as an attack on their legitimacy rather as an actual a democratic issue. So is that perhaps, are people ready to hear it? We're still in the middle of this. We're recording this, in February 2019. Still no deal. And it doesn't, it feels as divided as it ever was. And, it's like half of the people accept that there's some kind of problem with dark money and fake news. And the other half of people think you're just saying that because you don't like the referendum result, which is why I asked you, has the same work been done into the Remain side? Is there... I guess I'm just trying to figure out, if only half of the people think there is a problem, are you ever going to get any change?
I think there's a real problem.
And is there a problem?
We're seeing this across, and I think the problem is that we do have this issue now with it's a kind of equivalent, a battle for equivalence. And I think it's a false battle for equivalence where we have to see, and even just like get into the weeds of some of our work. I published a story a few months ago about the DUP's donation. The Electoral Commission, there was a really great BBC Northern Ireland Spotlight documentary about the DUP, Brexit and dark money, presented by my friend Jim Fitzpatrick, which I'd recommend anybody to watch. It's available on YouTube. And that goes into, it's a really great programme, full of reveals about a man called Richard Cook, who lives in Glasgow, and his waste company and all the rest of it. So I FOI'd, I sent freedom of information requests to the Electoral Commission to see what conversation they had internally about it. This programme brought out a lot of new information. It was great. The Electoral Commission spent some total of about 7 or 8 emails, initially going, there's some really interesting new material. That's then going, no, we're not going to look at it though, really. We think it's all fine. This happened for 2 weeks, and decided we were going to make an announcement on the same day, because Priti Patel had made a complaint to the Electoral Commission about Remain. They'd spent about 8 or 9 months looking at it, ruled that there was nothing to see, and they said we should actually put these two out together at the same time. Before they even looked at the Spotlight programme in any depth, they decided these two announcements should go out together. And that is part of the problem, is that we're seeing this in terms of a tribal political thing. And that's one side of it. And the other side of it is we're looking for politicians to do something that they're not really going to want to do, which is to bring in more transparency. Politicians don't like transparency. And this is what this is about. It's about transparency. So people know. So if someone comes up onto the BBC and says, I'm from this think tank, you know where the money comes from. And you can ask them about where that comes from. If a politician is standing on a political platform, you know where the money behind them comes from. And that, without that, America, we can see what it looks like when that doesn't happen. It's so easy to do. It's to look at America. You can see what that does to a political system.
Do you think that's the way we're heading in the UK? Do you think that's where we're going?
We don't have Citizens United, thankfully. We don't have that level of, and we still don't have that level of culture of political spending. But the flip side of it means actually really small amounts of money can make a big difference. And it's one of the reasons why I think the Brexit referendum stuff is really important. Is because, say the DUP, that £435,000, which is a lot of money, can make a big difference. I think that's the big issue. Is that, and even going forward into other elections, small amounts of money can make a big difference.
Is it the money, or is it the way the money's spent? Because we talked about the analog versus digital. Remain spent an awful lot of money, but how many minds did they change? And it seems more from a lay perspective, it's not necessarily that there was a massive financial advantage to the Leave campaign. It was more that the way they were spending, and crucially perhaps that their message. And if you go onto the OpenDemocracy.net website, there was a piece I was reading, I think it was published quite recently, about some of the ads, the Facebook and social media ads that you'd managed to get a hold of. And I was looking at these things saying, couldn't say that on the telly, and I don't know if you could say that in a paper. Some of it was very, very bad taste. So you could have very little money. But the way that it appears that money was being spent was perhaps, I don't know, did you find, would any of those ads have broken laws?
No, because we don't really have, it's very, very difficult. It's very hard to get to the stage. Political party advertising is covered by the Advertising Standard Authority, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to say, at what point you would actually break a law. What are you selling? It's not quite the same as saying this detergent is better than all the other detergents. Often the message you're saying is actually quite different to that. I know some of those, because actually it was a story I wrote about Facebook ads, which is quite interesting, because what had happened was on the back of the Irish abortion referendum, where we did a lot of work on that in Open Democracy as well. And during that referendum, money was pouring in from the United States into the anti-abortion movement. And that started becoming an issue, and people started talking about it a lot. And Facebook were starting to get under pressure. So they brought in this news thing saying you can only spend money on advertisements in Ireland if it's money that's been spent within Ireland. Which is quite easy to break. We showed that you could break it quite easily. But that was their new rule. And on the back of that, they brought in kind of what they call transparency reports for only a couple of countries: the United States, Brazil, and Britain. So if you go onto Facebook, it's hard to find. Most people don't know what's there, but you can find these kind of weekly breakdowns of advertisement spending. So I started looking at these, and I started seeing, you could see that the anti-Brexit groups, their spending was starting to trail off in the last few months. A couple of pro-Brexit groups, one in particular called Britain's Future, their spending was really increasing. And the thing with the anti-Brexit groups, Brexit for Britain and People's Vote, they don't declare all their spending. I think they should have to. But they also have campaign headquarters. You can ring them up and talk to them. Britain's Future is just a web page. Like, there's one person's name associated with it. It's not even remotely know how that it's spent £250,000 on ads in the last 2 months. There's no clarity whatsoever. There's not even a hint of clarity about where this money could possibly have come from. But that's not against Facebook's advertising standards, because what Britain's Future is doing is going on and saying, this is Britain's Future, this is a Facebook page, here's an ad. So that's what all the transparency is. That's Facebook's transparency. And that's the difference now with the older political model, which the Labour Party goes on and has an ad. And okay, it's tied to the Labour Party. You know who the Labour Party are. You know how to find them. And actually, it's still the case, say, with they're still quite analog, People's Vote and Best for Britain. You can still ring those people up and go, what is this ad? What are you doing? You can bring them on the radio and all the rest of it. They've got contact numbers. These guys don't. There's no footprint for any of this. But it's not breaking any of Facebook's rules, because they're telling you who's funding it. It's just a name. And that's part of the problem. And this is where the dark money kind of thing comes from. To go back to the very start of it, the Democratic Unionist Party, £435,000 from Brexit came from something called the Constitutional Research Council, which sounds grand, but really it's only got one known member, a man called Richard Cook, who lives outside Glasgow. It's called an unincorporated association, which basically means it doesn't have any legal standing whatsoever. We could create the Outwith. We could call it the Outwith Research Council.
Let's do it.
Right
Who's
now
got £5 million?
Yeah, we can do it now. And
everyone's rummaging in their pockits.
We can make political donations. We don't have to publish anything. We don't have to publish accounts. We don't have to publish addresses or anything. And that's why, and that's kind of the epitome of this sort of dark money. It's the use of what are basically essentially front groups to pump money into the political system.
And are we seeing more of it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we are. It's hard to tell. It's definitely hard to tell, but I think it's fair to say that there's more, because I do think Brexit has been a kind of because Brexit in particular is a thing where you've got outcomes that are quite discernible. It's definitely something that has, in the past, people
focus the mind.
It does, in a way. Like, we've always seen people spending money to influence stuff. The tobacco lobby has been spending millions and millions and millions for years, often spending money on particular politicians and all the rest of it. But I think this is more sophisticated. And what it's part of is kind of like buying the idea space, because historically parties produce things like policies. They produced ideas. That's really gone now across the political spectrum. There's been a hollowing out of that, and all of that stuff is now coming from this world of lobbyists and think tanks. And that world is it's actually a much more corrosive form of corruption of the political system than the kind of traditional backhanders, where you just give somebody money to do something for you, because actually this is buying the idea space.
So what do you think the future holds?
For open democracy?
Well, I think for our democracy in general. I mean, if this is the way things are going, if, you can wield an awful lot more influence on platforms like Instagram, Facebook, you can reach an awful lot more people than you could with a televised party political broadcast, for example. You can tailor that message a lot more than you could, for example, with just a blanket leaflet that gets printed out a couple of dozen thousand times. Are we changing enough to meet that demand? Is there a problem that needs to be resolved? And do people care? I mean, that's the thing which strikes me the most. Do people care enough about this change to actually make politicians want to do anything about it?
Well, to go backwards about do people care about what's happening? I think the problem at the moment, because it's still getting pulled into a kind of a partisan political debate, but it really is not about. It shouldn't be about this. It should be about, well, how do you regulate democracy in the 21st century? How do we regulate democracy in the digital age? It's quite clear that this system is broken. There's no two ways around it, because the big difference now is that, say take Facebook ads, take these Facebook ads we're looking at. Almost none of those Facebook ads from pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit have been paid for by political parties. But they're pushing messages that some in political parties totally want, whether they're people who want a second referendum or people who want a hard Brexit. So that's a totally different space to what we used to have, where you'd have messages being pushed by political parties. Now you're seeing interest around particular issues, and this is almost certainly going to increase in the United Kingdom as we into the coming years. And that's a huge difference. And this is what you see in America, where you're able to be one step away. It's not the campaigns that are doing it. It's someone else. It's a super PAC. It's an interest group. So you can disassociate yourself. Probably the most famous thing where people became aware of it in the United States and here was if you remember, listeners, way back when John Kerry was running against George Bush, and there was these ads about what did John Kerry do. These swift boat veterans. John Kerry was a celebrated Vietnam vet, and basically there are attack ads against John Kerry, funded by dark money. And that was a really significant moment. And ever since then, we're starting to see this more and more, because it's about having leverage in the political process. In terms of what is going to be done about it, I think it is. The report that came out from Parliament was really scathing. It's basically saying the electoral regulator is not working. It's broken. And I think it's really incumbent on everybody, all elected officials, to go, well, actually, this isn't a party political thing. This isn't something about Remain and Leave. It's not a Brexit thing. It's something that we have to tackle. And the sad irony is that, the European Union has been in the last couple of years is finally waking up to this, and it's definitely getting its act together on this. But across Europe, we're going to have the European elections coming up in May. We're already starting to see it. Just broke yesterday this story about Matteo Salvini and the Lega Nord getting £3 million from Vladimir Putin. And it's been stood up. So this is where money is coming in, and in political, this is the big difference. £3 million into a political system, can reap millions and billions of pounds as an outcome. So for people who want to influence the political process, the returns are huge. You can make a lot of money if you can influence the political process.
Right. Well, we're going to put our hands down the back of the sofa, see if we can find that 3 million quid or 5 million quid. We'll start our Outwith. What's it called again? What kinds of...
Oh, the Outwith Research Council.
The Outwith Research Council. And so if you want to donate to that, feel free.
And if you want to donate to Open Democracy, go to www.opendemocracy.net.
I accept cash. Just kidding on. No, but there's obviously there's lots to think about with this. Lots of background reading to do as well. Unfortunately, Peter, you and the team at Open Democracy have been working on this fairly consistently for a couple of years. There's some fantastic articles on there, OpenDemocracy.net, and it's still very much an ongoing story. I mean, we're in the middle of this.
We're continuing, the reason I'm plugging it because we're continuing to raise money to try and keep going with this, because there's still so many unanswered questions, and there will be. We're going to do. I think we'll be doing a lot of work in the European Parliament elections as well, because we do work on a pan-European basis. We'll continue to be doing work in the United Kingdom. There will be a general election eventually again, and a lot of these issues are going to recur again. I think these are not. This is the way our democracy is going to be run into the future, and that's why it's so important to address it now.
Okay, so do check out that website. Do, of course, listen back to the podcast to see if you can get more out of it, but certainly a story very important to keep following. We're going to leave it there because I'm very aware that we could keep talking about this for days, really, especially since I've just had my wine delivered, so we keep going for quite some time, but we will wrap it up. Thank you very much from everyone here at Outwith. Before we go, Peter, we've plugged the website. If we want to follow you on Twitter, which is the best way to get hold of you.
Find me at Peter K. Geoghegan.
At Peter K. Geoghegan. And of course, if you want to follow the Outwith podcast, which I'm sure you're already doing, we're at Outwith a podcast. We have lots more, of course, up from the podcast. We're now in our second season. If you want to go back and listen to any of the other episodes, do check them out. We're on iTunes, we're on Stitcher, we're on YouTube, we're on a bunch of other podcasting apps. So do follow us. Hit subscribe if you can, that way you won't miss out on our new ones. And one final plug, I'm very aware we're plugging everything here. Do you want to put a shout out to our sponsors, the Ferret? And remember, if you use the code OUTWITH19, that's OUTWITH19, when you subscribe, you can either get 3 months free, or if you're going for an annual subscription, you get £9 off an annual subscription, which is a very good deal.
It is a very good deal.
It's exceptionally good deal.
I think it's a very good way to support independent journalism.
It absolutely is. So head to the Ferret. That's theferret.scot. Subscribe and remember to use your code OUTWITH19 to get a cheeky little discount. Thank you very much, Peter. It's been great having you in the kitchen.
Thank you for taking me to the kitchen.
And stay tuned, hit subscribe, and we'll hear from you all very, very soon. Bye-bye.